Okay.
Hmm.
So
But now,
urinary
because of the
gonadotropin.
human cells, now they are having recombinant human FSH, म्हणजे डेल्टा आणि एप्सिलॉन असे दोन आलेले आहेत, which are 2 times more potent than the recombinant FSH, which was
Okay.
available earlier. And I think आता तुमचं जर असेल एमक्युअर वाल्यांचं रिसर्च असेल तर यू ऑल कॅन मॅन्युफॅक्चर दॅट. आणि ते काय लॅबोरेटरीत तयार होणार आहे एन मास, तर तुम्हाला कितीही तयार करता येतं.
नाही नाही, वी आर ऑन दॅट वे की गोनाडोट्रोपिन्स ची लाईन टाकायचं आहे, पण नथिंग हॅज कॉन्क्रीट हॅज हॅपन्ड, बट वी आर ऑन दॅट वे, थिंकिंग ऑन दॅट वे.
Yeah, but instead of just purifying the urine,
हा.
it is better that you have a recombinant technology. The only difference in urinary and recombinant is purity.
ओके.
Hmm. So, आणि कसं आहे ते युरिन कलेक्ट करणं, आणि ते मस्ट बी अ व्हेरी व्हेरी कंबरसम जॉब, क्लिनिंग अँड ऑल दॅट, and
ऑफकोर्स.
getting rid of the proteins. I think once you achieve a good cell line and a good recombinant technology, mm, मग तुम्हाला काही लुकिंग बॅक नाहीये.
हो, यू आर राईट. बघूया, वी आर ऑन दॅट वे, लेट अस सी.
राईट.
सो मॅम, वी स्टील हॅव 5 minutes टू गो, है ना? तर आपण वाट बघूया थोडीशी. मी इन्व्हिटेशन लावू, मी इन्व्हिटेशन शेअर करतो, तुम्ही स्टॉप स्क्रीन करू शकता थोड्या वेळासाठी.
हो हो, I'll do that. I'll do that. So stop share ना,
या.
इथे रेड वन.
हा, रेड वन. बस,
करेक्ट.
फॅन्टास्टिक.
असं हे केलंय का, सगळ्यांना कळवलंय का?
हो.
It's going to be only for you all today.
नाही नाही मॅम, आम्ही सगळ्यांना कळवलं आहे, त्याच्यात काही प्रश्नच नाही. इनफॅक्ट साधना मॅम कल लॉग इन झालेल्या आणि म्हटलं अरे काय तू स्टार्टच करत नाहीये, म्हटलं मॅडम काल उद्या आहे उद्या. तर मॅमला मी आज पुन्हा मेसेज पाठवला की मॅम लॉग इन व्हा, आम्ही लिंक ओपन केली आहे. अँड शी हॅज सर्क्युलेटेड टू हर ग्रुप ऑफ डॉक्टर्स ऑल्सो.
ऍक्च्युली इन्फर्टिलिटी वाले डॉक्टर्स कमी आहेत थोडे.
हा, नाही इम्पॉर्टंटली काय ना, पीपल विल अंडरस्टँड द इम्पॉर्टन्स ऑफ सिरीज. बोला बोला मॅम, तुम्ही फोन घ्या.
हॅलो. हा, अल्ट्रासाऊंडचं काय? नाही नाही, तिला उद्या सीझरचं सांगून टाक, IVF ची पेशंट आहे ती.
आता सायकल सगळ्या सुरू झाले असतील त्या मॅडम. You are unmuted. Immunities. हा, फाईन. या.
सायकल सुरू झाल्या आहेत, पण बरंच इकॉनॉमी डाऊन असल्यामुळे लोकांकडे पैशांचा बराच प्रॉब्लेम आहे.
हो. मला वाटतं अनदर पोस्ट दिवाळी, मला वाटतं मॅडम ते जरा व्यवस्थित सुरू होतील.
I know.
या होपफुली.
बरेचसे people have lost jobs and all that has really affected them.
करेक्ट. पण थोडंसं सेकंड वेव्हचं अजून म्हणतात आहे, पण त्यान पॉसिबिलिटी कमी आहे, कारण इम्युन सिस्टीम स्ट्रॉंग बऱ्याच लोकांची झालेली आहेत.
नाही, पण ते इम्युनिटी हार्डली 3 महिने अँटीबॉडीज मिळतात, नंतर नाही मिळत.
राईट. होपफुली सेकंड वेव्ह नाही आली तर विल जस्ट चांगलं होऊन जाईल पूर्ण.
Should we start?
Yes, ma'am, we can start. It is almost 5. So if you give me the permission, I'll start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Join झाले का नाही कोणी अजून?
मॅम आहे, साधना मॅम आलेले आहे, पराग सर आलेले आहे, गीता मॅम आलेले आहेत. So there are people who are every time who are coming with us. So we'll start. People will keep joining.
So share screen करू मी?
मॅम एकदम एक इंट्रोडक्शन देतो छोटूसा, and I'll announce and then we can, है ना?
Okay.
Yeah. Good afternoon and welcome everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Dr. Amit Borse and I'm a group product manager with AIVA, a division of Emcure Pharmaceuticals Limited. Emcure is a pioneer in the field of gynecology and IVF. Programming 28 is a scientific theme for the year, and we are proud to announce that we have done 126 plus webinar in this 6 months. Importantly, the new initiative, Materna School of ART, where Dr. Manju Jila ma'am's master classes have been a highlight, is today, it is the third part of it. And if you can see on the screen, the first 2 topics, evaluating infertile couple, and the second topic, azoospermia, are already on YouTube and you can look at it. Today, ma'am is going to discuss about understanding gonadotropins and its use in controlled ovarian stimulation for IVF and IUI. As always, this would be a very interesting session and I'll request all of you to stay put. Thank you for joining. Ma'am, all over to you now and you can share your screen.
Yeah, so now I have to go for slide share, right? Good evening, everyone. Wishing everyone a very happy Diwali in advance. And I think this is going to be our 3rd lecture. I thank Emcure for allowing me to speak to my colleagues who are interested in infertility. And in that respect, today's topic is going to be a very intense topic because gonadotropins are the molecules which we are using to a very great extent in our day-to-day infertility practice. And it's very important that we know something about these molecules which we are using. And we know since 100 years, we've been trying to modulate the hypothalamo-pituitary-ovarian axis in a way that we get more and more oocytes so that we can achieve fertility. After clomiphene and other anti-estrogens, we got in our hands about 60 years back gonadotrophins, that is directly the pituitary gonadotrophins, FSH and LH. We know it is these hormones which allow the cohort of follicle to grow, and as FSH levels fall, a single follicle starts growing, which we do not want. We want to maintain the FSH level and allow the entire cohort to grow. So this is the pituitary gonadotroph which secretes gonadotrophins. Now let us understand the biochemistry of these gonadotrophins. The pituitary secretes three types of gonadotrophins, that is FSH, LH, and TSH. And the placenta secretes human chorionic gonadotrophin. These hormones are a family of glycoprotein hormones. About hormones, we can understand one thing, that our body is controlled by a neuroendocrine system. The hormones which are acting locally are at a higher level, that is those coming from the brain to the hypothalamus are like P substances, or from the hypothalamus to the GnRH neurons are kisspeptins. So they are just small peptins or small decapeptides or octapeptides. And as you go lower, the pituitary secretes hormones which contains carbohydrates and proteins. So these are glycoproteins. They have a longer half-life and they act at a distant area from where they are produced. Now let us understand FSH, LH and HCG. These hormones are called as the gonadotrophins because they act on the gonads. All these three hormones have a similar alpha chain made up of 111 amino acids and a very specific beta chain. The beta chain of LH and HCG are almost similar. That is why we use HCG instead of LH to bring about the final maturation of the oocyte. In the FSH, the alpha chain has got, it has got a three-dimensional structure in such a way that it fixes to the FSH receptor. Now these two chains, alpha and beta chains, they are not covalently bound. They are just held together, and attached to each of these chains are carbohydrates. And two carbohydrates in the FSH molecule are attached to the alpha chain and two carbohydrates are attached to the beta chain. Now, there is a lot of importance of this carbohydrate. Now, all the FSH molecules that we get in the market basically have the same alpha and beta chain. What is different is the carbohydrate part attached to the alpha and the beta chain. And depending upon the complexity of the carbohydrate, the negative charge on the carbohydrate depends the pH of our FSH molecule, and the pH and these carbohydrate will decide the half-life and the sensitivity of these FSH molecules to the FSH receptor and therefore their effectivity. So for a long time, we were not knowing much about it, but this picture very clearly shows that FSH is a glycoprotein containing alpha and beta subunit and 4 carbohydrate chains attached to it. Different isoforms are because of only the different carbohydrates. There is no change in the alpha and the beta chains. They are the peptides which are very, very specific. Now, the sialic acid is a part of the carbohydrate. More the sialate, more is the negative charge and higher is the half-life of that FSH molecule. So if we see the history of how we got this FSH molecule, initially in 1960s, we got the human menopausal gonadotrophin. Now, what is this human menopausal gonadotrophin? We know it has got 1:1 activity of FSH and LH. But overall, these are just FSHs because LH is not very stable. Its half-life is hardly a few hours, not even half an hour. And therefore, even if you say this is HMG, actually it contains just FSH. But in the market today, in order to get an LH activity, instead of FSH or instead of LH, the pharmaceutical companies add HCG to the FSH in the menopausal urine. And the problem is HCG has got a very long half-life of almost 36 hours. And therefore, if you give HMG injections every day, you start concentrating LH activity in the woman's body. And therefore, premature luteinization, poor quality oocytes can happen. And so we focus more and more on FSH rather than HMG. Then after HMG, we got the urinary FSH. Then in 1992, we got recombinant FSH. In a few years, we also got a highly purified FSH. Now, what is this purified, highly purified, and urinary? If you just take out the urinary FSH by chromatography, you will get a group of FSH molecules with different carbohydrates and different pHs. Like some will have pH of 3.5, the others will have pH of 4.5. Whereas if you take highly purified, you'll take only one specific FSH molecule with a pH of say 2.5 or 3.5. And that is it. So the highly purified are very acidic. The non-purified are a mixture of acidic and basic. But the recombinant are mostly basic FSHs. Now, what is the difference between basic and acidic? So in 1950s, we got the urinary FSH. After that, we got the recombinant FSH. I told you that recombinant FSHs are basic FSH. Basic, it's not basic, but they are less acidic. Their pH may be somewhere between 5 to 6. Now, they are not manufactured in the human ovarian cell lines. These FSH molecules are produced in the Chinese hamster ovarian cell lines. So these cells are kept in the incubators. They are the vector for human FSH is encoded in their genetic material, and they start producing. We know that DNA produces proteins. So the alpha and the beta chains are correctly produced by the Chinese hamster ovarian cell lines. But once this peptide or this protein comes out in the cytoplasm, the ribosomes and the Golgi apparatus add the carbohydrates and modulate this FSH. Now the human ovarian cytoplasm does it differently from the cytoplasm of the Chinese hamster cell lines. And so these FSH molecules or the recombinant FSH has got very small carbohydrate chains, and they do not have sialic acid, and so their pH is high, and higher the pH, shorter is the half-life, but they have a higher affinity for FSH receptor. The human, now there was a paper, I have just quoted this paper in 2004, where Anderson tried to explain to us how these different FSH molecules which we are using are. So he said that there are a number of molecules in the market available, and they are all glycosylated forms, and depending upon their purification depends their pH. So the basic peptide backbone is the same, but the carbohydrate chains are different, and depending upon how complex the carbohydrate is and how much of negatively charged carbohydrates are present on those carbohydrate moieties depends the pH and activity of the FSH molecule. And the urinary are more acidic, whereas the recombinants are basic. The human pituitary itself at different times of menstrual cycle and different reproductive ages produces different types of or isoforms of FSH, that is variations in the attached carbohydrates. So early in the menstrual phase, we produce, or the ovary oocyte, the pituitary produces an FSH which is extremely acidic, has a lot of sialic acid contents, and has a very long half-life. Whereas around the time of ovulation, when the follicle has crossed 14-15 mm, the FSH produced becomes more and more basic, and so has a shorter half-life. So this chart will show us that initially in the soon after menstruation, we have more acidic FSH in our body, and as the follicle grows, we start getting more and more basic FSH in our body. In the reproductive life of a woman also, when she is young, she produces more of basic FSH or an FSH with higher pH. Whereas as she ages and after menopause, she produces more and more of acidic FSH, which has a much longer half-life. So the key points are that FSH is a highly heterogeneous protein due to the presence of different silated oligosaccharides, which are linked to the beta and the alpha chains. Higher the sialic acid, more acidic the FSH. Degree of silation impacts the stability. That is, more silated, more stable and longer half-life. So the FSH isoforms, the basic FSH or the less silated FSH isoforms are potent because their receptor binding ability is strong and they produce more estrogens. Towards the end of woman's life, there are more acidic FSH. So whatever urinary products we get, they are highly silated and they are acidic and they have a much, much longer half-life. Now, what is available in the market to us? We know we have a urinary FSH, which is simple urinary FSH. I'm just quoting Metrodin here, but now in the Indian market, all our pharmaceutical companies are producing a urinary FSH. This urinary FSH, if we see this, not the highly purified one, it contains both the acidic or highly silated FSH and the basic FSH. The one which is highly purified FSH, which is also a urinary product, contains more of a very high amount of acidic and very less amount of basic. Whereas if you see the Gonal-F, that is contains only or mostly the basic FSH or having a very short half-life. Well, so in short, if we compare, the acidic or the urinary FSH have a longer half-life, higher biopotency, they produce less estrogen, they have a higher follicular threshold, and the follicular growth rate is slow with the urinary FSH. Well, sometimes you will see you are pouring FSH molecules or giving them injections and injections of FSH, but in a very small percentage of patients, you will not see a response. This is because FSH, where does it act? It acts on its receptor on the granulosa cells. Now, these receptors are very specific, called as G protein receptors or the 7 transmembrane receptors. The 7 transmembrane receptor is nothing but a long chain of amino acids which has got an N terminal and a C terminal. N terminal is outside the cell membrane and the C terminal is inside the cell membrane. And this protein is folded around itself 7 times. Therefore, it is called as a 7 transmembrane receptor. And in these folds, there are sites where its specific hormone will get attached and make specific changes, and then it will act like a messenger to ask the DNA to produce the activity of the cell. So TSH, FSH, LH all act via its specific 7 transmembrane receptors. And any single nucleotide polymorphism or any change in these receptors may not allow the action of FSH to take place on the granulosa cells, and the follicles may not grow, or these patients may require larger amount of FSH to show a response. Similarly, any single nucleotide polymorphism in the FSH beta chain also can produce similar effects, and therefore we may see some women who may have very high circulating FSH but not much response on the follicles. So both the FSH receptor and the beta chain of FSH should be perfect in order to get a ovulatory response. So we saw that we have urinary FSH and we have recombinant FSH that is produced from the Chinese hamster cell lines. But recently in 2010, one more FSH molecule was introduced, and that is corifoliatropin alpha. This is a long-acting FSH. Now we know that pharmaceutical companies always want to produce things which will be easier and easier for patients to use. And that is the advantage of corifoliatropin alpha. That is, its half-life is 65 hours. It remains in the body for 7 days. So if the patient comes on the 2nd day of the cycle, you just give her 1 injection of corifoliatropin alpha and you call her after 7 days, and you will see a cohort of follicles grown to 12, 13, 14 mm size. So that reduces the number of injections. And what is the technology used to increase the half-life of FSH is on the C part or the C terminal of the FSH molecule. Like we see in HCG, there are 4 more carbohydrates attached on the beta chain at the C terminal, which increases the half-life of FSH, producing chorephylletrophin alpha, which lasts in the body for 7 days. So here we see the scale that it lasts in the body for almost 7 days. Now, we know that the problem with recombinant or FSH alpha is that its pH is high, its half-life is short, and so initially for some time we may not get a response. So many people combine the urinary and the recombinant products. That is, they use initially the urinary product and later on the basic or the recombinant product. But now we know that our problem in recombinant technology was use of Chinese hamster ovarian cell lines. Now they are using the human cell lines, the human leukemia cell lines, where they have introduced the vector or the gene for production of FSH. And we have now the pholitropin delta and pholitropin epsilon, which have got a similar silation like the human FSH, and they have a longer half-life and double the potency of recombinant FSH. So we know now, once again, actually what was urinary FSH? It was produced by menopausal women. So that was also a human cell production. This is also a human cell production. Only thing is, this is produced in the laboratory. It is much cleaner. It has no impurities, and it is just like the human FSH and highly potent. So they have done the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies of these new FSH molecules, that is pholitropin delta and epsilon. Epsilon is the latest one. It is found to be 2 times more potent than pholitropin alpha. And that is dose related. So if you give a 150 IU dose of pholitropin epsilon, the levels will be very high as compared to 150 IU of Gonal-F. And the response to this pholitropin delta and epsilon directly depends on the woman's AMH. Higher the AMH, higher is the response. So if you give a higher dose in a woman with higher AMH, you will get a very high response. So in dose of FSH, whenever we see, it is dependent on AMH, on the body mass index, on the ethnicity, age, and the ovarian reserves. But the most reliable indicator in the normal reproductive age group in normal BMI women is the AMH level. Now, after knowing all about this gonadotropin molecule or our FSH molecule, which we are going to use for ovarian stimulation, let us understand the ovary. Now, we know that for a follicle to become responsive to FSH, right from the primordial follicle till it becomes 5 to 6 mm or 2 to 5 mm in size, it takes almost 7 to 8 months. And we see different type of women. We see some women who have a large number of follicles in their ovary. And some, even at young age, even at the age of 25 or 26, we may just see hardly 3 or 4 antral follicles. Many of these young women who have lesser follicles are having some single gene disorders, many of which have been identified. So if you see very prematurely an ovary with decreased reserves, it is thoughtful or it is worthwhile thinking of certain single gene disorders in these women by which their follicles undergo atresia very rapidly. Now, our follicle, just before it becomes sensitive to FSH, it starts producing AMH. So AMH tells us how many follicles are just going to become FSH sensitive. And before it starts producing AMH, from the primordial follicle till the secondary and the very pre and small preantral follicles, there are a lot of paracrine substances produced by the granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte and the oocyte itself, by virtue of which the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle. That is, the oocyte gets surrounded by granulosa cells. Then the primary follicles gets a cuboidal layer over it that is just the beginning of the theca cells. And so we call it the secondary follicles. There are many things, many small molecules produced by the granulosa cells and by the oocyte, by which these changes are taking place. And then these follicles just become preantral, start secreting AMH. And after it stops secreting AMH, it gets sensitive to FSH or gets the FSH receptor and starts the aromatase activity. And it is here that it is only in this field that our FSH is going to act. So depending on the number of follicles which have become preantral, or depending upon her AMH level, we know how many follicles we are going to get, whether she is a hyper responder, a normal responder, or a poor responder. So this is one more, this is a paracrine control. Before it becomes after the secondary follicle, before that is a paracrine control, and after that is a endocrine control. And as the follicle is growing, at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, a cohort of 8 to 10 follicles you will see in the ovary. But as one follicle dominates, the others become small and finally atretic. This is what normally happens because estrogen gives a feedback, reduces the FSH and the type of FSH, and therefore only that follicle which has got the highest number of receptors for FSH and the most sensitive receptors for FSH will grow, and all the others will undergo atresia. But this is exactly what we do not want. We do not want our follicles to undergo atresia. So soon after menstruation, by the second or third day, if we start giving injections of gonadotropin, these follicles will not die. They will continue to grow, and probably we will be able to derive an oocyte from each one of them. So in a spontaneous cycle, a single follicle will grow. In a conventional stimulation cycle, where we start exogenous FSH from the second day, we will have the whole cohort growing. But in a soft protocol, when we want lesser follicles to grow in a hyper responder type of a patient, maybe we may start our FSH a little late. So a few follicles will undergo atresia and the remaining will start growing, which is called as a mild stimulation or a softer protocol. So aim of any ovarian stimulation, aim of getting these follicles out of the ovary is to maximize our success rate. Now I'm speaking in respect of IVF. We need more follicles, we need more eggs, and we can give more success rate. So to maximize the success rate, to minimize the adversities like ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome or multiple pregnancies, to maximize the patient compliance, that is to have minimum difficulties to the patient, and to minimize the cost, make it as cost effective as possible. So these are the chief aims of ovarian stimulation in patients undergoing IVF. So whenever we look at an ovary, we'll feel, okay, we want more eggs, why not give more FSH? But how many eggs do we need to maximize our success? We need around 11 to 15 eggs. In this chart, we can see that after we get more than 15 eggs, the transferable embryos that we have usually are never more than 8 to 9. So there is no point in bombarding the ovary with FSH beyond 15 follicles. It is seen that the pregnancy success rate plateaus after we get 15 follicles. So we should not aim for more than 15 follicles when we are stimulating the ovary. And if we get more follicles, supposing we have a patient with lot of antral follicles and we bombard her with lot of FSH and we get about 30 to 40 follicles growing, the pregnancy rate plateaus. Like even if she had given us 15 follicles, we would get the same pregnancy rate as we would get if she had given us 25 follicles. But the chances of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome increases very rapidly after 15 follicles. Therefore, we have to use milder protocols in PCOS or hyper responders, and a little stronger protocols in those with lower reserves. Besides, when we stimulate the ovary very rapidly, we also produce certain adverse effects on the endometrium, and that may affect implantation. Do we have any effect on the genetic material of the oocyte when we hyperstimulate? So it does not. Ovarian hyperstimulation does not increase embryo aneuploidy. It is seen that even in an unstimulated cycle, the aneuploidy rates are just 67%, whereas in the stimulated cycles, they are around 77%. So it really does not increase significantly the aneuploidy rate. So ovarian response and number of oocytes retrieved has a good prognostic value in IVF, robust surrogate outcome of the clinical success. Now what happens is, if you are going to transfer embryos in the same cycle, we do not have an increase in the live birth rate after 15 follicles. But if we are going to freeze all and transfer, then there is a linear correlation between the number of oocytes derived and the cumulative pregnancy rate. So with increased risk of OHSS after we have more than 20 oocytes, increased risk of preterm birth and low birth weight after we have more than 20 oocytes. So important association between ovarian response, oocyte retrieval and IVF outcomes. So ovarian stimulation within acceptable limits is safe and efficient. Okay. Now, we have said that we want around 15 follicles. We cannot get 15 follicles in all the patients, but any normal responder, what do we take as an indicator? Okay, she is a hyper responder or a normal responder or a poor responder. What tells us? Since we are gynecologists and we are using ultrasound left, right, and center, we will all depend on antral follicle counts. We can see a beautiful PCO ovary and we are very happy that we are going to get a lot of eggs in this patient. And we may see some patients where we may not really be able to see a good number of follicles. Now, what should be our starting dose of FSH? In which patients we have to be careful? Who are the hyper responders? Which is the best indicator to tell us all this, whether it is an AFC or AMH? Both are good. AFC depends on the type of equipment or the machine that we are using and the operator who is using it, and also the patient parameters, how well we can see the ovary in the pelvis, whether there are adhesions or any other pelvic factors. But AMH is a very consistent marker of ovarian reserves. It just tells us that how many preantral follicles are there. And now when we are going to start the stimulation, supposing I do her AMH today, I will know round about, okay, in this cycle or now I am going to get 12 to 15 follicles growing. So what is AMH? It is a dimeric glycoprotein in the group of transferring growth factor beta. It is produced by the small granulosa cells of the small antral follicles. Okay, and so these are immediately going to become antral. And so how many small antral follicles are available with us, the AMH levels is going to tell us. So AMH carries a better weightage than AFC in knowing what is going to be the response to our gonadotrophins and how many eggs we will be able to retrieve from this stimulation. Besides AMH, we know the dose of gonadotrophin also depends on the body mass index. So fatter the patient, higher is going to be the requirement of FSH. Older the patient, higher is going to be the requirement of FSH. Certain ethnic groups require, like the African blacks, may require more FSH than the Chinese and the other Asian groups. And smokers, because the vascularity to the pelvis decreases, may require higher FSH. But if these factors are not there, if we have normal patients in a normal reproductive age group, then In most of the patients, we need not, keep monitoring the FSH response and adjust the dose. If we have a starting dose of 225 or 150 IU, supposing you are using a recombinant product, we know that if it says that this is 150 IU, it is going to be 150 IU. So in a normal BMI patient with a normal AMH or a normal ovarian reserve, we can just keep it as a 150 to 225 IU for all the 10 days of stimulation, and you will get the entire cohort of follicles growing. Individualization of dose requires intense monitoring, more often ultrasonography. Some people will depend on serum estrogen level rise. But all this is now, we have now realized that it is not required. You just start a specific dose fit for that patient and call her on the 8th or 9th or 10th day and see the number of follicles which are growing. So there was a trial which shows that individualization or fixed dose makes no difference in the live birth rate. The only difference it can make is in a small percentage of patients, cancellation of cycle due to poor response, or appearance or cancellation due to chances of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome may happen when we do not individualize. But in most of the patient, a fixed dose of 150 to 225 IU for 10 days of FSH is enough to get the entire cohort of the follicles growing. This is known as the Optimist trial, which was done in more than 3,000 patients, and it was shown that there is no difference. So when we are stimulating the ovary with FSH, do we have to do other hormone parameters? Like on day 2, should we be doing a serum progesterone level, or should we be doing an LH level? All this is not required. Just monitoring the ovary with ultrasound is enough. Just one more thing we have added to our armamentarium, that is knowing the serum progesterone levels on the day of HCG. And why do we want to know serum progesterone levels on the day of HCG? Is because the FSH which we are giving, the granulosa cells which produce estradiol may take a shortcut pathway and start producing progesterone. And this progesterone may damage our endometrial or change our endometrial window, or may affect our implantation. So we do a serum progesterone on the day of HCG to decide whether we are going to transfer embryos in these patients in the same cycle, or we are going to freeze them and transfer in the next cycle, because endometrium has got advanced, because progesterone secretion has already started before the follicle has ruptured. So that is the importance, and the cutoff level of progesterone on the day of HCG is 1.5. Okay, so we know that we have given gonadotrophins and we have allowed the whole cohort of our follicles to grow. But is that all? That is not all. Our hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis is active, it is intact. The estrogen which is coming from those number of 10, 15, 20 follicles is naturally going to produce premature LH surges. And in some good 30% of our patients, the follicles will already rupture before you take these patients for pickup in IVF. So we need to stop the premature LH surge, or we need to suppress the pituitary in order to prevent an premature LH surge and to time our IVF pickups, so that everything is in our hands. So how do we achieve this? We do not want the pituitary to get, we know that the estrogen goes to the brain, the kisspeptin molecules, and there these kisspeptin neurons have got a lot of estrogen alpha receptors. And once the estrogen levels rise, there is a surge of kisspeptin, which causes a surge of GnRH, and that causes a surge of LH. And this LH surge will cause premature luteinization of the follicles, which is detrimental. And so we need to stop the pituitary when we are giving gonadotrophins for 10 days for ovarian stimulation. And how we stop the pituitary? By the use of certain drugs which will stop the GnRH. And the way in which these drugs are given, accordingly we call them as protocols. Long protocol, or long agonist protocol, or short protocol, short agonist protocol, where we are using GnRH agonists, or antagonist protocol. So what is that? Let us see. So GnRH is a decapeptide. It has got 10 amino acids, and this amino acid number 6 is changed in GnRH agonist. And after this is changed, this GnRH becomes extremely potent. So the normal GnRH has hardly a half-life of 2 to 4 minutes, and it is not detected in the blood also. It is only detected in the portal circulation near the pituitary. So what do we do after changing this, making a change in these decapeptide? That is, if in Lupride there is a leucine added instead of glycine. Otherwise, a tryptophan, like if I'm not wrong, or a serine, some amino acid is changed, and that makes these GnRH have a longer half-life, and they are more potent, or they have higher affinity to the GnRH receptor. And so what they do is, once they get attached to the GnRH receptor, they cause expulsion of all the FSH and LH from the pituitary, and they cause internalization of the receptors within 7 to 10 days, making the woman completely hypogonadotrophic. That is, the pituitary completely stops producing any FSH and LH. And once she becomes hypogonadotrophic, no premature LH surges will occur. We can start giving our gonadotrophins from outside, safely stimulate our ovary, and then give it the rupturing dose of HCG from outside. So that is about agonist. So agonist has to be given before we start our stimulation. So that is a long protocol. We start a agonist in the mid-luteal phase, that is on the 21st or 22nd day of the cycle. That is 8 days before her expected menses. And we wait for her menses. After her menses, we do a transvaginal ultrasound. We see that there are no cysts in the ovary. And then if you want, you may check a serum progesterone, or straightway start off with your FSH. And give your FSH for 10 days. So after we give this, we can give a GnRH agonist injection daily, or you can give a depot preparation, which remains in the body for 1 month. Now, for many years, we never had an antagonist. But recently, we got antagonist in the market. And in antagonist, many amino acids are changed. In ganirelix, these are the changes. In citrorelix, these are the changes. And what they do is, they immediately block the GnRH receptor. So they can acquire the receptor, or they can get attached to the receptor, but they do not produce the action of the receptor. So they block the receptor, and therefore immediately FSH LH production stops. It is like locking off the pituitary. So here we see that in the long protocol, all the FSH LH will come out. There is a flare first, then there is desensitization, and then there is no FSH LH. Whereas in the antagonist protocol, what happens is after the pituitary receives the antagonist, immediately FSH LH production is stopped. So agonist has to be given much earlier, before we start the gonadotrophins, whereas antagonists are given on the 5th or 6th day after we start the gonadotrophins, when our follicles become 14 mm in size. And it has to be given till we give the rupturing dose of HCG. What is the advantage of antagonist over agonist? Is there is no flare, there is no estrogen deprivation symptoms, stimulation begins immediately after follicular recruitment, there is shorter treatment. We can also combine clomiphene citrate and gonadotrophins in an antagonist protocol. And the choice of ovulation trigger, that is, we can give a Lupride for rupture, that we will discuss later. But instead of HCG, we can give a Lupride. Lupride is which causes the pituitary LH to come out. Because we all know that the culprit of ovarian hyperstimulation is HCG. And previously, when we did not have antagonist, and when a woman developed too many follicles, we used to cancel the cycle saying she'll land in hyperstimulation syndrome. But now we don't do that. We give a Lupride, that is an agonist. And it causes release of all the FSH-LH from the pituitary and brings about the second meiotic division of the oocyte. So Antagonist versus agonist, no relevant. What is the effect on endometrium? We feel that antagonist is better on the endometrium than the agonist. Most of the studies show that endometrium is like the natural cycle in antagonist as compared to the long agonist. Now, GnRH antagonist versus agonist in PCOS. So we will use the antagonist in PCOS as compared to the agonist because we can give Lupride for rupture instead of HCG. Of course, to use antagonist, you need experience. And in experienced hands, agonist and antagonist give almost the same clinical pregnancy rates. And in low responders, it is the short agonist, that is starting the agonist from second day of the cycle. That in lower responders, there is less response of the follicles. You need more FSH-LH. So if you give initial GnRH analog, all the pituitary FSH-LH will come out and stimulate the cohort of follicles. So short protocols or flare protocols may be helpful in poor responders. So we saw that we could block the pituitary with agonist or antagonist and therefore not bring about a premature LH surge. But we have realized that why should we? There are so many patients who are hyper responders, who are PCOS, who are egg donors, or who are only freezing their embryos and keeping eggs or embryos for social reasons. So why should we give them agonist or antagonist? Why can't we simplify their pituitary suppression by a simple tablet of progesterone? What are we doing in our OC pills? That progesterone suppresses the release of FSH-LH and therefore suppresses ovulation. So progesterone can be used instead of your GnRH agonist or antagonist. That is no long protocol, no antagonist protocol. From second day of cycle, give a tablet of medroxyprogesterone acetate daily and start with your FSH stimulation for 10 days and there will be no premature LH surge. This is a protocol, or progesterone prime stimulation is a protocol used in egg donors, which is cheaper. It is also used for social freezing or in all those cycles where embryo transfer is not going to happen or where we are not bothered about the endometrium. So the premature LH surge can also be prevented by use of progesterone. It is a safe way, especially in oocyte donors and freeze-all cycles. But overall, it is seen that the live birth rate with antagonist is much higher than that with medroxyprogesterone acetate. Why it is so, we still don't know. But today we know, even for egg donors, when we use medroxyprogesterone acetate to prevent LH surge, the follicles look beautiful, all look similar in size. But the fertilization, the blastulation rate, and the pregnancy rate with these embryos is lesser than when we use a GnRH antagonist. Now, we know that progesterone doesn't allow follicles to grow. I mean, the LH surge to happen. Okay. And we also know that the ovary is producing follicles almost every 8 to 10 days. You start getting a wave of antral follicles. Whatever is the ovulation cycle, whether the follicle is 14 mm, 18 mm, if there is a luteal phase, every time you do a transvaginal ultrasound, you will see a few small follicles around in the ovary. So we can also have a luteal phase or a late follicular phase stimulation. That is, we stimulate that small cohort of follicles which is coming up or becoming antral. And in this luteal phase stimulation, we need not give any agonist or antagonist. And this luteal phase stimulation is very important in cancer patients where we have no time. They have to start their chemotherapy early. So we don't bother about what is the cycle time. We just say, okay, I can see a large follicle, I start stimulation. I can see a corpus luteum, I start stimulation. Because I can take all the small follicles which are there in the ovary. So anytime start, late follicular start or luteal phase start of stimulation is possible. And in these, you do not need to give any agonist, antagonist or progesterone. So we have stimulated our follicles to the size of 18 to 20 mm. And now we have to give the final maturation dose of LH. We know we have blocked the pituitary, so pituitary is not going to stimulate unless you open its gates. So, or we have to give a surrogate of the LH, that is HCG. And we have already seen that HCG is a gonadotrophin with a very long half-life. It remains in the body for more than 36 hours and it produces the same effect like LH. So when we are using a long protocol, our pituitary has no LH in it and we have no choice other than HCG to bring about the second meiotic division. But when we are using an antagonist protocol, our pituitary contains lot of FSH and LH. All we need is to open the gates and let the LH come out. So we can use an agonist in an antagonist protocol to bring about the second meiotic division of the oocyte. So what is this LH surge doing when the follicle grows to 18-20 mm or when the follicle matures? What is the LH surge doing? Okay, so here this diagram shows us that we have an LH rise for about 14 hours when we use a agonist trigger, for about 48 hours in a natural LH surge, and for about 6 days when we use human chorionic gonadotrophin. Why do we not use LH and why do we use HCG? Because LH has got very less carbohydrate in it and it has got a very short half-life. Some say 30 minutes or even 60 minutes, but the normal half-life of HCG is 24 hours. So we prefer to give HCG for rupture instead of LH injections. And it is difficult to have LH, even though now we have recombinant LH with us. What is this LH surge doing to the follicle? It is actually bringing about the second meiotic division or the haploid division of the oocyte, bringing 24 chromosomes and one polar body outside. So it causes disruption of the oocyte cumulus cells, causes resumption of meiosis, and causes luteinization of the granulosa cells and secretion of progesterone starts after the LH surge. Which HCG are we going to use, urinary or recombinant? If the drug is good, both are good. But recombinant has got more batch-to-batch specificity and temperature tolerance of recombinant is better than the urinary. And when will we use GnRH agonist instead of HCG? Agonist can be used only and only in an antagonist protocol. That is, when we have given citrorelix from the 6th or 7th day, daily, we can give an agonist when we see more than 15 to 20 follicles and we feel that this patient can have a risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. We do not give HCG. It is only HCG, HCG and HCG which is the culprit of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So instead of cancelling her cycle, we can give an agonist trigger, remove all the follicles, and maybe we will not transfer in the same cycle. We will transfer embryos in the next cycle. Is there anything we have to be careful about when we are using Leupride for rupture? That is, the basic LH activity in the woman's blood should be more than 0.5. Only then Leupride will be effective. Otherwise, we will get an empty follicle syndrome. So if it is less than 0.5, LH activity is less than 0.5, we cannot give Leupride for rupture, only Leupride for rupture. We may have to add around 2500 IU of HCG. Only then we will get oocytes. Otherwise, we may not get oocytes when we aspirate the follicles. So limit of use of GnRH agonist is only in those patients where LH is more than 0.5. So in these cases, we can check the serum LH levels and then only give the rupturing Leupride. When we add HCG to Leupride, we get better pregnancy rates in fresh transfers. Of course, fresh transfers in hyperresponders is really not done now because of the excellent freezing protocols that we have in the IVF laboratories. Frozen embryos give much better pregnancies in hyperresponders than the fresh embryos. But if we are giving frozen embryos, if we are giving fresh embryos, then we have to give an intense luteal phase support when Leupride is given for rupture because the corpus luteum dies very fast and there is no luteal phase support left. And if we transfer embryos in a agonist trigger, then because of luteal phase defect, we may have a failed implantation. So we have to give high amount of estrogen, progesterone and low doses of HCG till the 10th week of pregnancy. The best thing when we have hyper responders and if we have decided to use GnRH agonist as a trigger, we should freeze all embryos and transfer only in the next natural cycle. This is because we want to prevent one of the most dangerous iatrogenic complication of the use of gonadotrophins and HCG in women undergoing gonadotrophin stimulation for ART, that is ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. A syndrome, today I'm not going to discuss about this syndrome. It's a long, lengthy procedure. I'm not also going to discuss about luteal phase defect. The only thing that I would like to say is this syndrome starts exactly on the 5th day of rupturing HCG, if we have given HCG, and lasts for 7 days. And if you transfer embryos and patient becomes pregnant, it starts again on the 12th day of oocyte pickup and lasts for about 15 days. And it is a dangerous syndrome where you may have fluid in the abdomen because of shift of fluid in the third space because of VEGF secreted by the small antral follicles or the small follicles. You may have ascites, you may have hydrothorax, you may have hemoconcentration, renal failure, and ICU admission to the patient. All of that can be prevented by just using a simple agonist transfer and freezing all embryos instead of transferring in the same cycle. Well, now I think we have learned a lot about gonadotrophins, how to use them on the ovary, and what should be the dose, which should be the protocol. So let us discuss two cases. Patient A, her AMH is 1, her BMI is 35. She wants to undergo IVF because her husband has a poor sperm count. She wants to undergo ICSI. So what protocol of stimulation and how much dose will you use? And patient B, her BMI is 26 and her AMH is 9. She wants to undergo IVF because she has got both her tubes blocked. So which protocol you will use and what will you advise her? I think we open this for discussion. Hello? Hello?
Ma'am, give me a minute. I'll just unmute everybody so that anybody who wants to ask question can ask. Dear participants, you are now have the access to open up your mic and you can actually speak up and ask your questions. Hello, Sadhna ma'am. Dr. Nilima ma'am, you can unmute yourself. Dr. Gauri Patil ma'am, Dr. Vinita ma'am, Dr. Payal Chobe ma'am. नहीं सुन पा रही है पर वो कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं पूछ रहा.
We had two topics of discussion. We had two cases. Right. So if anyone can answer the two questions, the two cases, first case and the second case. Dr. Sadhna, is she there?
Yes, Sadhna ma'am is there. Sadhna ma'am, you're a co-host. You can unmute yourself, speak. Gauri Patil ma'am, you're a co-host. You can unmute yourself and speak.
Case 1, AMH 1, BMI 35.
Hello. Yeah, hello. Yes. Hello. So the first case is AMH is 1. She has got poor ovarian reserves.
Correct.
and 35 BMI is high.
Yes.
So in this case, we will have to use FSH and LH in high dose.
FSH in high dose, yes.
High dose, yeah. And in second case, she is BMI is 26 and AMH 9 means she is PCOS.
Antagonist protocol, or you will use a flare protocol, or which protocol you'll use? You can use a flare or you can use an antagonist.
Antagonist
protocol, yeah.
Yeah.
Second one?
Second one, she is with high AMH. That means she is PCOS.
PCO, hyper responder.
Yeah. So here, sequentialization of cycle we can do. We can stimulate her and freeze all the eggs.
Correct.
Now, antagonist protocol.
Right. And Leupride for rupture.
Leupride for rupture and freeze all the eggs.
And freeze all and transfer in the next
cycle.
Correct. That is correct. I think you have followed the whole lecture then. Any questions? Any questions?
No.
Dear participants, if you want, you can put your questions into chat box as well. So that can be answered.
Hello. I want to know one thing. Every time you have to do that LH activity, what you said before giving Leupride?
Not that way, but it is seen that if you give, people like to give more citrorelix, thinking that LH surge will occur. And what citrorelix is doing is it is blocking the your pituitary GnRH receptors, right? So at least some LH activity should be present. Some receptors should be present in order to allow your GnRH agonist to act on the pituitary. So at least 0.5 IU LH should be present in the blood. Otherwise, if it is below 0.5, your only Leupride may not work, and you may have to give additional HCG of 2,500 IU, which is a very low IU. Otherwise, we give 10,000.
So you mean to say with Leupride, you should always give 2,000 HCG on safer side?
No, that will also produce some amount of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. But
so then how do we still
by doing the LH, if you do an LH and if LH activity is more than 0.5, you get LH1, level of LH1 on the day when you are going to do rupture, then you may just give
Leupride. Okay.
But if LH is 0.1, then you will have to give Leupride with 2,500 IU of HCG. Okay, and for the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation, we'll discuss that about use of cabergoline and all that in our next lecture, where we are going to discuss about endometrium and luteal phase support and ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No.
So what is the next topic that we should be discussing? I think this was too much for everyone. Little more toxic, but next topic we'll make it simple. Endometrium.
Okay.
Or luteal phase support. I think in continuity of this, we should have endometrium and luteal phase support.
Support, right?
That will be fine, because this was absolutely fantastic topic, but it is purely a IVF sort of this thing.
Actually, I have not put any IUIs because I don't like people using gonadotrophins for IUI. You should reserve them for IVF.
Absolutely.
Just use aromatase inhibitors or CC for IUI.
Yeah, but it was very clear-cut take-home message, madam. It was really fantastic, the presentation slides and this thing. So the infertility or infertilologists who are there, madam, they are having a really very clear-cut take-home message. That is we really want to appreciate. So next topic, when we will keep a luteal phase support and endometrium, that will be okay.
That should be fine.
Yeah, fine. So post Diwali, madam, we'll just
we'll decide a date and post Diwali only now. And wishing everyone a lovely Diwali.
Yeah, thank you so, Dr. Manjujila, madam, for such wonderful talk. Thank you everybody who are attending this wonderful webinar series. And we'll just continue this in this thing also, having good topics. And thank you once again, madam, for such wonderful talk. And from our side, we'll wish you a very happy Diwali to you, madam, and to everybody. And thank you all. And please take care, madam.
Thank you,
Dhanyawad.
Kishore. Ma'am, a very happy Diwali to you,
Wish
and
you
a very happy Diwali to all the
participants.
participants. Now,
Right.
one thing what is very clear, ma'am, from these sessions, that these are continuously recorded, and we will be every time putting up a link in your invite itself where we can see previous topics were this.
Right.
So I will appeal to all the participants that stay tuned to this webinar, because there are very few webinars happening now which will be taking you from basics to advanced. So this will be a series which you can depend on for your practice hereafter. And we will give you an invite where every time this YouTube link will be active with the topic which has been covered. So ma'am, thank you for your initiative. Dr. Manjulila's masterclass has really been very wonderful in terms of academics, what we are taking to people. And it will definitely count. Thank you, ma'am. So with your permission, I can now close the session.
Okay. Thank you. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you, madam. Good night.